Good morning, everyone. We're going to wait a minute to let people trickle in, and then we will get started. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining the August Threat Landscape Briefing. We will be doing a Q&A at the end, so feel free to write any questions in there or the chat, and I will now be handing it off to Bryce.
Thanks, Lily. Thank you everyone for joining today. As always, we're going to go over the malware targeting and threat actor trends we've seen this month, as well as identifying proactive measures and mitigations against those. Taking a look at the threat landscape for this month, and to kind of give an overview of the campaigns we're going to cover. The first thing is critical infrastructure. CISA published its advisory on Iranian-affiliated PLC exploitation back in April. We did also talk about this last month in the threat briefing. It did update that advisory on July 22nd, and then 4 days later, more than 30 Minnesota water utilities were hit. Um, this was not an intelligence failure. This warning was published, it was accurate, and it was specific. The failure here was the gap between the warning and anyone acting on it. Secondly, we're going to look at AI tooling. Again, last month we talked about AI as the attacker and AI as the victim. This month is different. This month, AI tooling is infrastructure. Um, Researchers at Black Hat earlier this month delivered working compromises of production AI developer tooling. Um, so this wasn't a conference demo, it was a real working um, credential theft from CI/CD pipelines that hold repository write access. And the third campaign we're going to cover is less of a campaign and more of a trend that we're seeing. Vulnerability volume is becoming a defensive constraint in its own right. Microsoft has said that it's using its own AI-driven vulnerability scanning, and that's going to continue pushing patch, excuse me, patch counts up. Um, to clarify as well, the exploitation rate has not risen to match the vulnerability discoveries, but the triage burden has risen. Um, Diving into the first campaign we're going to look at is the water sector OT attacks. Um, This one I'm sure most of you are familiar with. This made national news. Um, what we know that's been confirmed is on the weekend of July 26th and 27th, more than 30 Minnesota community water systems had their operational technology attacked in a coordinated fashion. Minnesota was the first state to confirm. Um, Since then, the 27th, the FBI reported that at least 7 states had incidents. And as of early this month, there's possible intrusions in at least a dozen states. Um,
Hey Bryce, really quick, I'm
you,
sorry to interrupt. I don't think your screen is visible to some of our attendees, so I just want to make sure we get that sorted really quick.
oh, sure. Yeah, let me stop sharing and bring it back up again and see if that fixes it.
Okay, let's see. Can anyone confirm in the chat really quickly that the slides are visible now? Okay, perfect. Sorry about that. Go ahead.
No worries. Thanks for calling that out. Um, so the technique that was used in this, attackers are connecting to internet-facing or internet-exposed PLCs, and they're using the same vendor engineering software that the plant operators use. They are then modifying the controller project files and altering what the human operators will see. Uh, there has been no formal attribution to this, although CISA attributes kind of the broader PLC campaigns to Iranian affiliated threat actors. Looking at the specifics of the attack chain here, um, there are general takeaways to past specifics to the water sector. Firstly, looking at target identification, these controllers are findable. Anyone can scan the internet for the management ports that these industrial controllers listen on. Almost all vendors that are commonly used, like Rockwell, Schneider, Simmons, these are all vulnerable, vulnerable and are being actively targeted. Um, this isn't a single vendor problem. It really boils down to an exposure problem that happens to be visible across every vendor. Um, the second step here is access. And this is kind of important to note that the attackers are using the vendor's own engineering software, um, connecting from foreign hosting infrastructure. So if a controller is on the internet with no password, there is no hacking or no exploit involved. It's simply just becomes a login. Um, the kind of third step to this, and this is also a pretty important takeaway, is the controllers that did have authentication required. There's a vulnerability that is an authentication bypass in the Rockwell controllers, and that still remains available despite that vulnerability being 5 years old at this point. Rockwell confirmed that no patch exists, and one most likely is not coming in the future. Um, if your entire vulnerability management program is built around find the CVE, apply the fix, this vulnerability breaks that program entirely. Um, then the fourth thing is what they did with that access. So the attackers exfiltrate the PLC project files, which is the actual control logic of the plant. They manipulated reusable code modules inside those programs. They changed what operator displays show. So again, what the actual human operator seeing this, watching the screens, were seeing values that weren't real. And they changed passwords and IP addresses to lock out the local operators of their own equipment. Um, Another important thing to call out is CISA specifically flagged cellular modems that were installed by operators, vendors, or system integrators that may not be documented or captured in routine attack surface scans, um, and really warned about every organization, even those with mature security programs, validating all of their external connections. Detection for this campaign is a little bit unusual because the highest value action isn't a detection rule at all. It's an internal scan of yourself. Um, so firstly, scanning your own external ranges for any OT management protocols. This is a pretty quick and simple uh, step that would answer the most single important question in this campaign, which is, do you have any external exposure that the attackers are looking for here? Um, Secondly, just like I touched on in the previous slide, um, looking for any undocumented egress paths that the attackers would take advantage of. So things like cellular modems, any vendor installed gateways, any integrator remote access appliances. Um, like previously mentioned, these are often outside of IP management, outside of the CMDB, and outside of organization standard vulnerability scanning scopes. Um, the third thing is to look for um, engineering software from any unexpected sources. Um, OT engineering applications should typically run from a small known set of workstations. So if you see that software executing anywhere else in your environment, that's definitely worth a follow-up investigation. Um, and controller configuration change. So any PLC password change, IP address change, or project file download that does not map to a known change ticket, it would be wise to treat that as an incident until proven otherwise. Hardening and response for this um, is pretty straightforward, and a lot of this comes directly from CISA's recommendations. The first thing would be to disconnect the PLC controllers from the internet and route any remote access for operational purposes, either through a VPN or a gateway, rather than pointing it straight at the controller. Um, Enabling password protection and changing all of the default passwords. Um, Allow list IP addresses so that remote access is only permitted from known engineering laptops or other critical OT assets. Um, CISA also advised that after you disconnect a PLC from the internet, make sure that you have a known clean backup of the controller image. Because if an attacker has already been in and changed the password, you're locked out of your own equipment. Um, Most vendors, including Rockwell, do have published recovery guidance for controllers in this state. Um, so it's important to have that clean backup before you start making any changes in that scenario. And lastly, to validate every external connection. I know I've kind of hammered on this point, but it is extremely important. Um, Specifically the ones that your team didn't install. So again, things like vendor remote support, cellular modems are the biggest one that CISA's really warned about. These often get installed during commissioning and then they get forgotten, but then they persist in your environment and provide an entryway for attackers. The second campaign here is the agent harness, which is the AI tooling. Um, I know, like I said, last month we talked about AI is the attacker and AI is the victim. Um, this one is about AI infrastructure, infrastructure that your developers built potentially in the last 18 months that is now vulnerable. Um, at earlier this month at Black Hat, a security researcher presented working attack against AI coding agents from Anthropic, Google, and OpenAI. Each one of these were in its default shipped configuration. And essentially what that looked like was a GitHub issue would be opened by an account with no repository privileges, and that was enough to reach CI runner secrets in all three of those vendors' own repositories. Um, Kind of the important distinction too is that the framing here is in the harness, which is the code between the model and the real world excuse me, real world for lack of a better term. And that's where the failure here lives. Um, Across all three of these products, the same bug kept appearing. One part of the system marked a value as safe, and a later part of that system executed it anyway. That's not necessarily an AI problem. That's more of a classic validation bug in code that happens to be sitting between a language model and a shell. Um, the Claude code chain is the most instructive. It did take 3 rounds of patch and bypass, each fix revealing the next hidden assumption. The final version here, the agent had pre-approved access to Hugging Face, so the researcher or the attacker could exfiltrate an API key 1 character at a time by encoding it in public download counters. Um, for Gemini, OS command injection in its container launcher reached through automatic workspace trust in headless mode. Um, Both of these have been patched by Google and Anthropic. What was interesting is that OpenAI didn't receive a CVE and did not receive a patch, and their public position was that its sandbox behaved exactly as documented. Diving a bit more into the technical details of this exploit. Um, so an outside user with no permissions or no relationship to the project can open a GitHub issue. A workflow will pick that up and hands it to an AI agent for triage. The issue text from the GitHub issue is now inside the agent's context, which means it's now inside a process running on a CI runner that holds your secrets. From there, like I mentioned, it's a validation failure. For Claude, the command validator stripped single quoted text before it ran its safety checks. So a payload hidden inside a Git flag sailed past the check and hit the runner intact. The Gemini case is the clearest illustration of the hardest problem. The GitHub action restricted the agent's tools down to echo and viewing issues, which is a sensible restriction, but the configuration still registered a full shell tool and didn't enforce those restrictions at runtime. Um, they also sanitized the child process environment, so the secrets weren't there, but the parent process still had all of those, and in a shared process namespace, meaning a compromised child process can read the parent's environment and access all of those secrets. Um, what comes out on the other side is the workflow's API key and its GitHub token. And these workflows routinely carry write permissions because they're built to comment on issues and open pull requests. So write access to the repository is repository takeover, and a repository takeover means it's a backdoored package shipping to everyone downstream. Um, just for kind of context too, the Gemini CLI had around 2 million monthly installs downstream of it. Um, Kind of the important takeaway from all of that is for this campaign, there was no privilege escalation. The agent used exactly the privileges it was legitimately given. The attacker contributed nothing but text. Um, so if your security model assumes that attackers need to escalate, this kind of attack walks right underneath it. Um, a bit of a side note here, because that campaign paints a bit of a broader issue that we're seeing become more and more prevalent. Um, the coding agents themselves are kind of the visible tip of something larger. Um, MCP or Model Context Protocol is the connective tissue for AI agents. It's how an agent gets access to your ticketing system, your repositories, your documents. Um, Back in February, scanning found more than 8,000 MCP servers sitting on the public internet. Um, Many of these had no form of client authentication and no traffic encryption. And it seemed about 7,000 of those, or excuse me, a third of those 8,000 had potentially vulnerable server side or were potentially vulnerable to server side request forgery. Um, and that isn't theoretical either. Researchers used a proof of concept against Microsoft's MCP server. Researchers were able to retrieve AWS IAMA access keys, secret keys, session tokens, all from an EC2 instance. Um, and kind of the important part again here is that attackers are already scanning for these. Um, in just 2 weeks of ordinary web server logs, the SANS ICS counted MCP probes from 49 distinct IP sources. So this kind of validates that attackers are actively looking for these. Um, Another kind of important call out too is that in another POC, that hidden HTML comments in Azure DevOps pull request were able to carry indirect prompt injection. So Microsoft's official MCP server returned them verbatim. Um, the hijacked review agent then ran cross-project pipelines and exfiltrated confidential data using its own legitimate privileges. Um, so I know both of those were POC examples, but again, these are actively working exploits, and based on the probes, we can see that attackers are actively looking to exploit these. As far as detection for both the agents and the MCP servers, um, inventory is a strong start. um, Finding all of the coding agent binaries, finding the MCP client config files. Um, these most likely are not in your CMDB, but every one of these holds an API key, which does make it a credentialed asset by any definition that your policy already uses. Um, Flagging permissive execution modes, so agent invocations with permission skipping or autonomous flags and CI config are going to be the highest risk here. Um, the third thing is baseline CI runner egress. So CI runners should only talk to a small known set of destinations. Auditing your workflow triggers that are reachable by outside users. So any workflow that any authenticated external user can cause to run, that would definitely be a big red flag to find in your environment. And lastly, finding your exposed MCP servers. Um, Pretty straightforward, but just scanning both your internal and external ranges for any MCP endpoints in your environment. For hardening and response here, patch what does have a patch available. So for, again, Gemini and Claude, both of those did receive patches. Um, Scope all agent credentials to least privilege. So workflow tokens with repository write access should be scoped and short-lived. Separate untrusted input from privileged execution. Any workflow that ingests any outside content should not run in the same context that holds any form of deployment or publishing credentials. And lastly, treat MCP servers as untrusted third parties. So that means requiring authentication, applying zero trust controls at the tool integration layer, as well as putting agent connectors under change management like any other integration into your environment. The third campaign that we're going to look at here is kind of less of a campaign and more, again, a trend that we're seeing in the industry as a whole. Um, it's kind of the least dramatic of the three, but possibly the most consequential. Um, as I mentioned, Microsoft's Patch Tuesday counts continue to rise. due to its AI-driven vulnerability discovery. Um, Again, that ratio of reported vulnerabilities to exploited vulnerabilities isn't increasing, but these vulnerabilities still have to be addressed, adding mounting workflow to security teams. Um, how to tackle this? Patch 0 days first. This month there was only one actively exploited 0 day, so obviously that should be the first priority. Measuring your actual SLA before you argue about what the target SLA should be. A good way to do this is pulling your median time to remediate for actively exploited vulnerabilities. Um, Running two remediation tracks in parallel, so automate low-risk endpoints, um, and orchestrate production systems with stage rollout. And a big point too is that remediation is not just patching. So things like isolation, mitigation, and uninstall also fall under that category. Um, so kind of calling back to the first campaign, removing PLCs from being internet facing moves the asset out of that fastest tier of remediation. Um, I know we're almost out of time. Kind of the reason I brought this up as a campaign of itself too is that CISA issued a new binding operational directive. And while that currently only applies to federal, time and time again, we've seen that those kind of make their way into contract language, cyber insurance questionnaires. An important, kind of the biggest takeaway from that was that CISA said, um, if you can't prove that an asset isn't covered, they will assume that it's vulnerable. So again, finding all of those assets and having a good inventory in your environment, especially for things like those cellular modems, is becoming more and more important. Thank you. And if anyone has any questions, I know we're kind of short on time. So if you have any questions that you want to follow up via email, please feel free to do that as well.
Thank you, Bryce. I appreciate everyone's cooperation with the screen nail earlier. I apologize. Yeah, feel free to leave any questions in the chat, the Q&A, or like Bryce said, feel free to email. I am not seeing any come through. So our team will be sending out these slides and the recording shortly. Thank you, everyone. Have a great rest of your day.